Human Rights Commission has found that social media contributed to the 2021 July unrest, which led to the death of 350 people and the destruction of property and infrastructure. The report says the dissemination of inflammatory content through social media mobilized individuals towards disruptive action. Media Monitoring Africa's William Bird joins us now for more on that conversation. And we ask you tonight, should punitive laws be introduced to curb how social media can certainly be weaponized to create a whole lot of damage? 072-110-5584. Drop us an X at Newzroom 405. Should punitive laws be introduced to curb how social media can be weaponized? William, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for having me on the program.
Well, certainly weaponizing social media is a crime, but the question is it a crime that is punishable enough to deter those who participate in this? I mean, we saw social media being used to fuel the kind of actions that happened during the July unrest. But so far, one can say those actions have not really been punished. So it sends a message out there that these actions can be done without no consequence.
Yeah, look, I think so. When we're dealing with speech, it's always a tricky thing when you're dealing with someone that may say something that's clearly outrageous and clearly constitutes incitement, as opposed to something that may constitute some of the elements of incitement. And I think there we need to distinguish between two things. The one is you want to limit the harm that is being spread through online perpetuation of these particular things. So someone who says something that incites violence, for example, you want to make sure that those posts are removed as quickly as possible so that you mitigate the harm that it can cause. And at the same time, you also then want to make sure that those who originate or who disseminate that content themselves face some kinds of consequences. Now, we've seen just recently that the Electoral Court actually did hear a case about people that violated the Electoral Code, specifically on the basis of incitement, and there were particular consequences for that. So in South Africa, we actually have two laws that deal with incitement. The one is the Cyber Crimes Law, and the other is the Rights Assemblies Act. So incitement itself is already an offence. So people that seek to use social media to spread that kind of crime can, in fact, be punished. I think the challenge is often people do things under anonymous names. And what tends to happen is that the justice system, the way it deals with things, is a lot slower than the way that social media moves. So as I said, you want to do two things. You want to limit the spread of those particular online harms, and then you want to make sure that there are consequences for those that do that. So the idea of introducing a law that's going to do all of those things isn't going to work, because the law, no matter how efficient it is, can't work in that particular speed.
How do you do that when you've got to navigate, I suppose, views across the ideological spectrum, if you like? There are those who say, well, digital technologies, like yourself, you say they pose a severe threat to democratic practices, but there are others who say that curbing the use of these technologies would also hamper freedom of speech.
Well, I mean, it's a bit of a nonsense, that argument, precisely because in ordinary day living, we know that speech is legitimately limited. You can't go into your office and incite violence against one of your colleagues if you do it in front of your other colleagues. That's the same offence. So whether you do that online doesn't actually make a difference. The same principles need to apply online as they do offline. So we're not talking about any new versions or incursions on freedom of expression. What we are saying, though, is that where those occur, you need to have a mechanism that can limit that particularly fast so that you can avoid the kinds of violence that we saw in July 2021. One of the failures that we saw at the time was that there was an absence of sufficient communication across the board, but particularly from the state about what was going on, helping people know and understand what was going on. And then where people were inciting violence, there wasn't a mechanism in place for government to deal with how to actually address those particular issues. Some of them were dealt with, some months, in some instances, some years after the event. So this is part of it, is about the state working out a better mechanism of what to do when you're in that kind of a scenario where you effectively have some kind of a disaster that the state needs to respond to. So we saw during elections, for example, in the lead up to those, that there were better mechanisms in place to help identify those kinds of instances. But again, it's about that issue of how do you mitigate the harm online so that you prevent others from going and carrying out acts of violence, and then at the same time, how do you ensure that there are consequences for those? And all the role players have a role to play there. Social media companies must act as fast as they can to mitigate that. Now, one of the challenges is that a company like X no longer has any representation. There's no longer any means for any person in South Africa to engage directly with them. Not even our government can get a response from them. And you then got to say, well, we need a better mechanism for engaging with social media platforms and ensuring that they can be held accountable for the kind of content that they allow, and not just the individual players.
Cyber forgery, uttering false statements and so forth and so forth. It's something that personalities, especially in politics, maybe one can argue that elsewhere as well, are still doing. I mean, what have we learned there, as you put it, about closing that rather dangerous gap in terms of information that we allowed to happen during the unrest?
So, I mean, I think some of it is that you start to get online harms kind of interweaving with each other. So mis and disinformation often is accompanied with incitement. So people will say, look at this is a particular awful event that's happening now. And meanwhile, you analyze it and you see that the violence that they're showing was, from some years ago, was in a different country, or, it happened in a very different place. So that kind of thing is then disinformation, and how you deal with that has to be quite different to how you deal with the crime of incitement. So we do need far better mechanisms to deal with these things, as I've said, and that's that dual issue, the one of acting against it so that the platforms can act speedily and efficiently on that content. And the second is consequence for those that seek to spread it. And then when you're dealing with things like mis and disinformation, that we know is a global threat and a global challenge. And until we have better structural mechanisms for the platforms to actively disincentivize them from allowing the spread of those things, we aren't going to make a really meaningful dent on that. But it does mean that we can use the mechanisms that we have developed. We've got Real 411, that's a platform people can report these things to. We engage with platforms, they can then act on that quickly, and in a matter of hours, you can act against content. The news media themselves, particularly if you hit a national disaster like the July 21 riots, they can act in terms of making sure that they disseminate accurate, reliable information and challenging actively and consistently, a content that either perpetuates xenophobic, for example, or incitement, or mis and disinformation.
So for what you're saying, I hear that you're saying fact-checking interventions from civil society certainly are beginning to be helpful. You've got artificial intelligence interventions themselves, technology included in the process. However, when it comes to strategic communication interventions is where I'm asking whether government departments are doing any better. They're quite cagey, government departments, when it comes to information, and they let it run for quite a long period of time where they're saying, no, we're still coming up with a statement and whatsoever. And even the statement, when it comes out, it's quite vague in terms of some of the details. So it allows the perpetuation of the false information.
Yeah, you're completely correct. Mis and disinformation thrive in communication gaps. So when you've got heightened tension and when you've got escalated levels of anxiety and anger, that's when you need a lot of clear, consistent, ongoing, accurate communication coming out. So we saw, when you look at something like COVID, for example, initially the state's response was get the scientists on, and the scientists spoke to us and we all looked at them like they were talking another language, because for most of us, we didn't really understand what they were saying. And then you saw a whole lot of groups and organizations coming together and saying, we need to break this down. And that's when you saw far better communication occurring. Now, when it gets to a national disaster like the July 2021 riots, there you saw government going, well, they didn't have dedicated communications team in place to deal with that. GCIS was still expected to roll out and do communications on a massive wide-scale disaster, when in fact they still had effectively the same small team of people who were then suddenly having to communicate on something that they hadn't been given the skills, the power, and the ability to actually communicate those things. So you're completely correct. Governments, one of their critical issues that they have to address is making sure that as and when these disasters occur, they've got plans in place, they've got the mechanisms to put out accurate, ongoing, consistent information. And, they need to work with the media in order to make sure that they can do that they can issue that the media can then disseminate accurate, reliable information. Until and unless they do that, it means that those who, bad actors that want to spread incitement or spread disinformation, for them, it's an open invitation to continue to do so.
Challenge, though, with that approach as well, William, is that the counter narrative has already kind of been built into the conspiracy theories or the ideologies, where in some instances, they already tell you that, yeah, the state is lying. Even with COVID, that there was correct information that would have been put out there, but it was still being put out there by some credible people to say, no, the state is lying to you because they're trying to inject you, for example, with vaccines.
Yeah, and those things are very powerful. And again, part of it is then it comes down to the fact that you need credible, reliable communication, and that needs to be given and disseminated by credible and reliable sources, people and institutions that have high levels of public trust. And that's a long-term thing. You can't build that in 5 minutes. So when, the government and Eskom was telling us, oh, no, we'll deal with this power problem in just a year or two, and that was in like 2017, we all thought, okay, and now when they tell us these things, no one believed them. That was why when you saw in the lead up to elections, when they said, no, we really have got enough power, no one wanted to believe them because that undermined their own public trust and credibility to such an extent that no one believed anything they said about load shedding. And they still, to a large degree, have lost that. It's going to take years to build up any meaningful level of trust and credibility. But those are the key things that you have to do. And of course, the conspiracy narratives are there to undermine that, which is why, again, you need credible, reliable, accurate media to be part of that process, that when people put that out, they can just say, no, that's not accurate. The idea that the elections weren't free and fair in South Africa, people need to challenge that consistently and actively and say, if there's evidence, present it. But otherwise, there isn't evidence. You need to go with and you need to support the democratic process so that you consistently maintain the value that there is actually a reality and that things can't just be made up on an ad hoc basis.
From an educational perspective, strides being made. From a national security point of view, do you see ourselves going back to that point in 2021?
I would hope that the various bodies have learned some lessons. I think we saw in the lead up to elections that some of them had, the SAPS, for example, seemed to be a lot more prepared, and they at least were tracking some of these things. So I think that there's a better awareness and a broader awareness of the role that social media can play. To the extent that they've got effective strategic communication plans in place that can respond almost instantly, I'm not sure that we are there yet. To the extent that our government has learned the lessons and said we need to make sure that there's ongoing and effective communication and that we have to build public trust in our public institutions, I think that's a very difficult lesson for governments globally to adopt. I don't think we're unique in not doing that, but the reality is if we want our democracy to survive, if we want our democracy to deepen and continue to exist, we need credible media, you need credible public institutions, and you need the systems and the ecosystems around all of those things that continue to entrench the ideas around why you need democratic institutions, around why you need credible media that can be held accountable if they get things wrong, for example.
Media Monitoring Africa, that is William Bird. I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on.